Further ado, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. It's an honor for me to introduce today's keynote. He's a powerful and determined advocate for environmental justice, social justice, and reform of science to make sure that it is in service to people. One area of his expertise is exposure science, and he served on the National Academy of Science Committee on Exposure Science in the 21st Century. And when that report came out, it actually sparked a workshop by the Research Triangle Environmental Health Collaborative in 2014, and another in 2016. And that's actually where I was fortunate enough to meet today's speaker. And it was literally right around the day when my book on citizen science came out. And after speaking with him for like an hour, I just thought, oh my gosh, stop the presses. There's so much more I need to add to this book. And then I've spent the last few years learning so much more. He has expertise in community-based exposure assessment, air pollution monitoring, community-based participatory research, community-owned and managed research, and the use of the collaborative problem-solving model. And in addition to his many publications, he leads work that ends up with action on the ground that helps communities, such as communities in Charleston, South Carolina, in Mebane, North Carolina, and in the DC, Baltimore region, to name a few. He's helped empower communities to shut down incinerators, to make changes in post-disaster health service delivery, and in attainment of sewer and water services and other basic amenities. I want to note here that he has a conference that his lab is hosting. This will be the 6th year of it. We can put that in the chat too. And it's also going to be a virtual symposium, although it's not squished into one day. So there's keynotes over and events over several days. So be sure to check it out. He's an associate professor with the University of Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the School of Public Health, University of Maryland, College Park. So please welcome Dr. Sacoby Wilson.
Thank you for that great introduction. Hopefully y'all can hear me well. Can we do a share? I can take over the screen now.
That's right, just click that big green button.
Cool, thank you. So what I want to do in the next, how much time about 30 minutes?
Yeah, we got till, yep, you go for it.
So in the next 30 minutes is just talk about, again, thank you, Dr. Cooper, for the introduction. Just a little bit more background. So I'm Sacoby. I am a current board member of the Citizen Science Association. I'm a former board member of the CCPH, Community Campus Partnership for Health. So in this presentation, I'm going to really, talk about those two connections and really about, Citizen Science 3.0. How can we move forward with more just, equitable, inclusive, and action-oriented science? As Dr. Cooper mentioned, I do EJ work. So I really like to start every presentation now talking about environmental justice and what it is. Social movement fighting against the disproportionate burden of environmental hazards, locally wanted land uses, incinerators, chemical plants, petrochemical operations, landfills, hog farms, chicken farms, concrete plants, paper mills, any facilities that can impact the environment and human health. For some reason, they tend to always be found in Black communities, indigenous communities, people of color communities, low wealth communities. And you can look at, from the founding of this country, that's environmental injustice, the genocide of Native peoples. You can look at how enslaved Africans working in the fields were been exposed to arsenic, which is used as a pesticide. You go to contemporary times with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his work when he was assassinated in Memphis with the sanitation worker strike. You had Black men carrying around signs that said, "I am a man, recognize my humanity," right? You have in today's time the uprising against racism, people again carrying signs around saying, "I am a man." We have this whole issue with Black faces, white spaces, police powers being used to say, you shouldn't be in this space. You are less than, walking while Black, driving while Black, Starbucking while Black, couponing while Black, birding while Black, right? In your house, eating ice cream while Black, playing video games while Black, asleep while Black, and you see people being murdered, right? Dehumanized. Similarly, what happens to communities of color when it comes to being sacrifice zones, being dumped on. So I just want to show those parallels between why systemic racism is important to talk about and why environmental racism is important to talk about, and why social movements like the EJ movement really important. And the EJ movement has different streams, right? But I like to focus on the EJ movement. My EJ family is in North Carolina. So look at the fight against the PCB landfill in Warren County, North Carolina. Dr. Benjamin Chavis, you have civil rights leader. Dr. Chavis coined the term environmental racism in that fight. So in many ways, the EJ movement was started in North Carolina. So there's a lot to draw from. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of contemporary work there that I think we can really build around when it comes to environmental justice and why it's important. And as I said earlier, racism is a public health issue. In my opinion, racism, we already had a pandemic before we were dealing with the viral pandemic. We've been in a syndemic, multiple pandemics at one time. We've had a pandemic of racism for 400 years. So there's a public health issue. Environmental racism is a public health issue. And we have to do more to address that. And science has a role to play to help address systems of oppression in this country. And one of the main things I want to highlight in my work, so you got these communities, right, that are being dumped on by these hazards, landfills, chemical plants, etc. One of the main impacts is on air quality. So citizen science has a really important role to really look at these issues around air quality. I mean, think about COVID-19, for example. You've seen the studies that have shown that long-term exposure to particulate matter, you see higher morbidity mortality rates in counties with higher PM rates, right? Study out of Harvard. Recent studies are showing that the virus can adhere to, can be passed through aerosols, or the virus can adhere to particles and move long distances. Air quality is a risk factor for COVID-19. And so particulate matter is so important. Why is it so important? PM 2.5, what does that mean? 2.5 microns. It can get deep into your lungs, damage your lungs, right? It can cause asthma attacks, hospitalization, stroke, heart disease, elevate your blood pressure. It can contribute to diabetes, Alzheimer's. So neurodegenerative diseases too, right? It can also impact the development of the fetus, birth defects, infant mortality, cause cancer, may have already said that, impact mortality rates, and also impact life expectancy. So a lot of these communities we're talking about that I work in, air quality is the cumulative impacts of those hazards that can impact air quality, that can impact human health, that can lead to disparities. And that's why science, again, is important as a tool to help address these problems. So what can we do? In a lot of my work, we cover more of a sort of community science framework. So community engaged research framework, where you have outreach, consultation, involvement. So as you move from left to right on this continuum that you see an increase in trust, communication, and action. So outreach tends to be one directional. Consultation, you get more bidirectionality. Involvement is when you have a community advisory board. And in a lot of my work, the gold standard is community-based participatory research and also community-driven research. So you can put traditional citizen science on this continuum. I see it being more, if you look at traditional, and more involvement. But citizen science is more than that. I'll dig into that later. But there's some parallels, there's some similarities between what you see in citizen science and what you see in sort of this community-based participatory action research, et cetera, or community-driven research. And for me, the gold standard for community-driven research is actually community-owned and managed research, which was developed by the Western Revitalization Association, Omega Wilson, when I was a grad student back in the, a few years ago when I was a grad student. So I'm gonna keep it moving. So what is CBPR? It's about engaging the community in all stages of the research process, okay? There's a little difference here between traditional citizen science and CBPR. Again, I think, there's connections between the two, but development of, what are the questions? What's the study design? Analysis, data collection, analysis. So in citizen science, data collection is really, really important, but also data analysis, which is also important in citizen science. And then dissemination, and then what's important in CBPR, translating that research to action. So in CBPR, communities, you need a unit of identity, right? Remember I talked about relationships again. Process, transparency, communication. We need some Aretha Franklin. You gotta have respect and trust when you work in the community. To have good partnerships, you have to have good relationships. To have good relationships, you have to have respect and trust. You cannot engage communities without that. And also what's important, I work in a lot of frontline and fence line communities. What does that mean? communities that are hosting these hazards, hosting these LULUs, these local one land uses. They are the subject matter experts, right? We need to make sure we uplift their knowledge, community cultural knowledge systems in this work. So that's another important parallel with citizen science, because people have knowledge. You don't have to have a PhD to be a scientist, right? You don't have, so that's the thing about citizen science. Citizen science frees you up. It's, you know, it's a democratization of science. So I'm gonna get back to that when I get to a couple more slides, but just want to highlight CBPR, collect data, community unit identity, you have a lot of process and trust, and you translate to action, right? And so this gets from the work with CCPH, quality processes. We have to have good relationships. Meaningful outcomes is just not good enough to say, okay, we had a lot of community participation, check box. Did you actually improve air and water quality? Did you improve stormwater management? Did you improve access to natural amenities like clean the rivers and streams up, right? Did you improve conservation? Did you empower the community, right? Did you build more relationships between the community and state agencies that manage our natural resources? Transformation, you had different levels of transformation, personal, institutional, community. We all should be transformed when we work with community partners, when we do the work. So basically breaking out of our own biases and stereotypes about community. Transforming academia is really, really important to me. Community transformation. Did we help build capacity in that community to affect change? Did we leave them with tools? This thing about science, y'all. Science is not an end, science is a means. So are we leaving scientific tools in the hands of communities? That's another important way citizen science plays a really important role in communities. And so just quickly, one of the things I like to talk about is, my philosophy of doing science. So you had this guy, Ernest Boyer, who talks about the 5 dimensions of science. And this gets back to the point that Dr. Cooper made in the introduction. How do we transform academia? For me, we talk about knowledge production. That's the science of inquiry. In academia, we very much over-commodify them, right? But this is science of integration. The thing about community science, like CBPR, is very transdisciplinary. The thing about citizen science is also very transdisciplinary. In my work on, and I'll talk about some projects, we bring in ecology, we bring in geography, we bring in epidemiology, we bring in architecture, we bring in planning, right? We bring in conservation, we bring in environmental studies. So the work, environmental justice, the framework is very transdisciplinary. The work I do is very transdisciplinary. And so when you're doing this kind of work, you have to have transdisciplinary science to really to address these, these really transdisciplinary or complex problems. Then you have the scholarship of teaching, the scholarship of engagement, and the scholarship of application. I tell my colleagues and my students, if you're not doing all 5 dimensions, you're doing incomplete science. That's me. Because why do I say that? In a lot of frontline and fence line Egypt communities I work in, you got people who come in and helicopter in and extract. It's extractive science, right? Or it's colonial science, science of colonialism. We have to decolonize science. And one way to do that is citizen science is a way to break through again. Community science is a way to break through again. We want to make sure we empower community members with science. That's where the justice part comes in. We have to make sure we understand that science, in many cases in the past, has been done on people and not with people. So how can we do science that's other people, for the people, and by the people? How can we do science that's about STEM? How can we do science that's about action? How can we do science that's not passive, but that moves? How can we do science that's about social change? How can we do science that is just and also about justice? Okay, those things are important. And that's opportunities for us to do this with both community science and also with citizen science. And then in my work, and real quickly, I think it's important, again, these partnerships. So what are the issues that are important to the community? What are the impacts, the negative and positive impacts that they're having? And think about, as a scientist, as a student, what are the opportunities to collaborate? What's your why? Why are you there? What's their why? How can those whys have synergy? And what are the benefits? And what are the partnerships that can be, started? And I say for any issue that I work on, I can connect that issue to food, faith, family, health, and jobs. When we think about science, y'all, I think part of the problem is we make science too complicated in how we communicate with it. Communicate about science, I'm sorry. And that gets another part of communication, which I just messed up right there with my stammering, another part of communication. But it's really about how do you talk about science, right? So we think about climate change science, right? We get so focused on the big S in climate change science. What about the little s? Make climate change science, for example, proximal. Make it every day. Make it pocketbook. Let's make science proximal. Make it every day. Make it pocketbook. Environmental justice is about looking at the environments of where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, where we learn. That's proximal. And a lot of citizen science work is very much proximal, okay? Even though at the same time, it can also be crowd-based too, right? So just want to leave you with that slide about how we can build partnerships, how can we engage in communities that have a lot of these issues that I work on. And then, you know, Dr. Cooper mentioned her book. Here's a cover of it. Love the cover because it has a butterfly. You know, as a gardener, you know, I love my butterflies. And so citizen science is another way, as I said before, we can really provide more access to scientific tools. I mean, you think about citizen science, you have the opportunity, you got street science, you got different terms for crowd science, right? You call it public science. I actually think we've had some debates in the Citizen Science Association about terms, right? And I actually think a public science is probably maybe a better term, Dr. Cooper, than citizen science. We can have that debate another day. So public science will allow you to kind of capture the different types of citizen science, where community science will allow you to capture the more traditional types of community-based science, like community-based participatory research, participatory action research, or community-driven research, where again, citizen science, public science would give you citizen science, crowd mapping. That would be the way I would try to, you know, as we move forward, okay? But I think all different types of citizen science, what they do is really about the marketization of science, open access to data, this really, and using science to mobilize. Because, you know, a lot of citizen science, you know, people may have they may be curious about a particular question. And I think it's important that curiosity is there. And I think for youth who we want to get into science, tap into that curiosity is really, really important. As a kid, I always dreamed about being a paleontologist. I knew I was going to be a paleontologist at age 5. I am not a paleontologist, but what's important is I got exposed to science at that age through Odyssey of the Mind, other types of program through STEM that got me really on the science pathway. Citizen science is a really important way to engage youth, and this is something we can take home. And this gets back to the point of the HBCUs. We have to applaud what's happening with Dr. Johnson, Dean at Shaw University. We need to applaud what's happening at A&T. The reason why I want to highlight our historically Black college universities is it's the same thing. How can we get our youth of color who goes to institutions into the sciences, into STEM? I went to Alabama Agricultural Mechanical University. I'm a proud graduate of HBCU. And so I think citizen science is an important infrastructure to help those young folks learn about science, and then use that science in those communities where the institutions are, and use those scientific tools and skills to go back to where they came from, right? And empower the local communities. That's a really important element of citizen science that we need to highlight. And that's why I want to see more HBCUs becoming citizen science institutes, adapting public science. And I appreciate the leadership in North Carolina State. Because remember, some of you may not know this is a quiz question. Which state has more HBCUs than any other state? North Carolina. And what's the number? Is it 10? No, it's 12. 12 HBCUs are in North Carolina. Then you have your tribal college. We have an opportunity to diversify and be more inclusive in citizen science in North Carolina with the backdrop of the powerful EJ movement, y'all. North Carolina has the opportunity to take the nation forward in many ways because of the intersectionality of citizen science, because of the environmental justice history and contemporary work, and because of the HBCUs you have in that state. Okay, just want to say that for y'all. So take advantage of that. Build these partnerships. So benefits of citizen science, I covered it. Engage communities, shared knowledge, common vision, technology. I need to speed it up some, but I want to talk about technology. And then literacy, environmental literacy. One of the terms that I use in public health, we don't call it environmental literacy, we call it environmental health literacy. And this is a shout out to anybody who's on this call from NIHS, maybe Leah Mo Fallon's on this morning. But environmental health literacy is really about critical knowledge of environmental health. So getting back to the point of communication skills, how you really increase people's capacity and knowledge and skills to understand environmental health issues and to address those issues. So citizen science plays a very important role in both environmental literacy and also environmental health literacy. So we know about all the different types of really snazzy projects out there. A lot of citizen science, again, is rooted in bird watching, ornithology. You know, you heard about black birders. It's grounded in, you know, water quality monitoring. You know, you have different sort of ways to classify citizen science projects. There's different classification systems out there. So, you know, Galaxy Zoo, virtual, or what we call distributed intelligence, eBird, you know, investigative, the Roy classifications, mass contributory. So you have this massive contributory citizen science when you have a lot of people across the world, you know, working on a particular question, right? That's really cool, actually. Ability to classify a galaxy and have people do that together. And then you have more of this co-created citizen science, which is in many ways parallels community-based participatory research. And you have more, you can have this crowdsourcing kinds of citizen science. And you think about the Bonnie and Silka classification of partnerships. So just in the same way you can have community university partnerships as I talked about, you can have similar kind of citizen science type partnerships. So the contributory, maybe more, you know, when you're looking at development explanations, collaborative partnerships, and then co-created, again, is just like CBPR, developing the questions, you know, study design, gathering information, and getting all the way down to dissemination. But again, one of the differences between a lot of citizen science and CBPR, when you move past this paradigm, it's not just the dissemination, it's the translation to action. So that's one of the big differences. It's a translation to action, but you can bring that into citizen science. And I think this is a figure that Dr. Cooper created. I just want to borrow it for this presentation. So you have this, you know, more community science methods that we're talking about, community-based science method, place-based methods, and crowd-based methods. And I think, and I messed up the slide. I think what's important to note that, you know, a lot of community-based work is out there. Now I'll talk about this. We're really trying to collect data to compliance with regulations, right? And so I think with crowd-based, you know, we also can get data that can help with compliance with regulations and be able to move science forward, right? So think about with EJ work, if we're able to have sensors in communities that have air quality problems across the country. Now, a lot of the projects where we're doing environmental projects is more local, where we may only have a few sensors, maybe 10 to 20 in the community. But say if we can have communities that look the same, they're doing the same type of hazards in West Oakland, right, where Margaret Gordon is, or Vincent Martin in Detroit, dealing with the intermodal, the international traffic from Canada, the goods movement traffic, or down Omar Muhammad in Charleston, or dealing with hog farms, Naima Muhammad, Elsie Herring, Devon Hall with REACH. Say we're able to create these air quality monitoring networks and get that data from across the country. That's that crowd-based approach that's very powerful that would get us, from an epidemiologic perspective, it would increase the power of the studies. You know, so a lot of the regulatory monitoring, I think, is pretty useless, and I'll get to that for this purpose, but the crowd-based approach could be really useful for really understanding burden, exposure to these associations, and then translating that information to action. So, and then scalability, again, this is from Dr. Cooper. We can scale up, right? We can go from local to kind of these more national projects. So some of the work that Dr. Cooper's doing is important to this. Some of the work that's been done in North Carolina is important to this. So again, there's a lot of opportunity to do more place-based citizen science work and more, you know, sort of national or contributory citizen science work. And I think they can be leveraged. And the way they can be leveraged, Dr. Cooper and I, you know, have a proposal where we wanted to work with the NAACP and my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, to basically build out these citizen science projects across the country. So each of these organizations have chapters. Alpha has undergrad and grad alumni chapters. NAACP has high school chapters, college chapters and city chapters. So think about if we had these chapters, members trained in citizen science and be able to monitor for air pollution across the country at these chapters, or monitor for climate changes across the community, across the country at these chapters, or look at water quality issues. That's the power of contributory citizen science. And the reason why I was gonna get back to this point, I have a fundamental problem. Not fundamental, there is a fundamental problem, but I have a problem with the way the EPA monitors for pollution. And the reason why I have a problem with it is, you have these regulatory grade monitors, right, that are sparsely located. And there may be a monitor 10 miles, 20 miles from your house, okay? But then when they go through a permitting process, they don't actually collect data in your neighborhood to know what are the levels of pollution in your neighborhood. What's the current cumulative burden of hazards in your neighborhood? That's actually bad science, y'all. I'm an environmental scientist. I may not have said it before, but that's called exposure misclassification. So you use it, it may be 5 micrograms per meter cube 20 miles away. Does it mean it's 5 at your house, where the concrete plant is, where the sewage treatment plant is, where the landfill is, where the refinery is, where the fracking site is? No. But what happens is you have bad science in and bad policy out. That's why we need citizen science and crowd mapping, because we cannot rely on our regulatory agencies to get the appropriate data. This is a data quality issue. This is a data representativeness issue, right? We need to make sure we have better spatially resolved hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks measuring pollution in our communities. And it's not just air quality, it's also water quality. For those of us dealing with climate change and sea level rise, it's flood sensors. Where are our state agencies at? So one thing, you permit the facility, but you don't have the monitoring network to see what's happening with pollution for the facilities. That is a big issue in frontline and fence line communities. And this is one of the huge benefits of contributory citizen science. And even though that proposal hasn't been funded, in a lot of my work with Dr. Cooper, we are really pushing this combination of local base and contributory science working together, bringing the best of contributory citizen science combined with the best of CBPR, okay? So, and this is again another shout out to NIHS, who should be funding some of this stuff that we're talking about if you're on the line, William O'Fallon, okay? So you have this kind of community-engaged research enterprise. I showed you that continuum right before. So this just gives you how citizen science can fit in. The citizen science enterprise, as I was saying before, just show you a visual, how it connects to the community-engaged research enterprise. So you see this sort of first box around citizen science, research collaborating with community members. You see crowdsourcing, right? You got gaming DIY. I do a lot of work around app development too. And so I just want to show you a representation of how citizen science is really can be integrated well in community-engaged research. Again, so my point about how we can bring CBPR and contributory citizen science together. So there's some tools out there that may be of interest to folks. So there's this air casting site of AirBeam. We do a lot of work with the Purple Air Sensor, which is a really good, has a good R-square with some of the regulatory grade monitors. Mapping tools are really important also in citizen science. These geospatial mapping tools, you think about, so another term, think about public participatory GIS or story mapping. These are also ways to bring in citizens, right? And so you got EPA EJ Screen. My state, we developed a tool called Maryland EJ Screen. I know North Carolina, because through a settlement agreement with the state agency DEQ, is working on their own mapping tool as well. And other states have tools too, like Cal Environmental Screen. And of course, EPA has citizen science toolkits around air quality. Clean Air Carolina has done a lot of really great work around citizen science in the state of North Carolina. So that's a great resource for people to connect to. And then of course you have SciStarter, which is also another great resource to connect to a lot of citizen science projects as entry into getting folks engaged in citizen science and then connect them to other ways to bring that work in. So I want to say that, and Karen, give me your hand. How much time I have left? 4 or 5? Okay, 5 thanks. So citizen science is a really important way to empower citizens. And you say, well, is that misspelled? No, it's not misspelled. I was told by one of my community mentors on the board of CCPH, actually. She said, Sacoby, you can't give us power. but you can help us connect to the power we already have. Help us actualize our power. So that's the power of citizen science. We can help folks actualize that power. Remember, science is a tool. It is not an end. It's a means to an end. And that end could be many things. It could be education. It could be conservation. It could be, counting birds. It can be getting water quality readings. It could be shutting down an incinerator, changing zoning. But that's the power of citizen science, is the fact that we can empower folks. And so just a couple quick examples of the work that we're doing. As I said, I was a grad student working on issues on basic amenities in Mebane, North Carolina, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, with Omega Wilson, the Western Revitalization Association. And so for those of you who don't know the story, the community hosts a sewage treatment plant, but not connected to sewer water lines. These are what we call post-Slavery Black neighborhoods, and also pre-New Deal. The New Deal was supposed to put in infrastructure in all the communities. But remember I talked about systemic racism? Like racism is embedded in all our policies. For some reason, they didn't get infrastructure. And the reason was because of the color of their skin, okay? Racism is the reason why. And so you have these issues of not getting sewer water infrastructure, about to be displaced by this highway, right? And so Omega's group came with this framework called Community Owned and Managed Research. Chris Haney, John Cooper, and John Cooper is now the VP for Community Engagement at Texas A&M. Chris Haney is now an associate professor at Hopkins. I'm now an associate professor at Maryland. We all were students working together with Omega, which is the power of students, man. I love working with students. So any students on the line, you can have impact while you're still learning, y'all. You don't have to wait till you're done with your degree to have an impact. So Chris and I helped train residents to collect their own water samples. And we did a septic system study. So we found high rates of septic system failure. We found high rates of E. coli and other fecal microbes in well water samples. This is important because this information was part of an administrative complaint that they submitted to the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights and the EPA. This work helped delay the 119 bypass. This work led to first-time installation of sewer water infrastructure. People's roads were not paved, right? So that's, again, the power of working in science with communities, okay? Think about North Carolina CAFOs. My mentor who passed away on this work, Dr. Steve Wing, he was the people's professor. So you're talking about using science to really help understand the problem. And this is the power of citizen science. Think about all the CAFOs in North Carolina, 10 million CAFOs. Adult hog releases more, 10 million hogs, an adult hog releases more waste, but I think 5 to 7 times more waste than an adult human. When we send our waste to a sewage treatment plant, their waste goes to the pit in the ground called a lagoon. That is not technology, right? And there's impacts on air quality, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, impacts on water quality, right? And so if you look at, again, this whole connection with racism, Dr. Wing did this map. Look at where the CAFOs are compared to formerly enslaved Africans. So what's past this prologue, y'all, is not by accident where those operations are in North Carolina and how the disproportionate burden of those operations on people of color, Black, Latinx folks, low-income folks, low-income whites, and people who are on well water. And then y'all are in the hurricane zone. Y'all remember Hurricane Floyd in 1999? Y'all remember this from Hurricane Floyd? You remember Hurricane Florence a few years ago? 11 trillion gallons of rain were dumped, Hurricane Florence. So that's opportunities to understand use citizen science and climate change. You have citizen science projects right now that focus a lot on climate change. How can we focus that on this issue of hog farms? How can we focus this issue of citizen science, bring citizen science in to look at the issue of climate change in North Carolina? Those are important questions, particularly in rural North Carolina, y'all, where people are already struggling with poverty, and then they have to deal with coal ash ponds, and they got to deal with hog waste, okay? And then, so you see Hurricane Florence, the flooding again. So you got flooding, Hurricane Floyd, flooding, Hurricane Florence. Lessons were not learned, but how can citizen science, for all you students, professors, advocacy groups, citizen science is an important way to help get data to help address this problem and empower folks. And this will be my last example, because I got what, 2-minute countdown, Dr. Cooper? 1 minute? Okay, last example. So I do work in Uniontown, Alabama. Uniontown is a community that's 20 miles from Selma. Uniontown, the per capita income is about $12,000. Okay, so we have extreme poverty in this country. And you're like, oh, look at that pretty mountain in the background of this first picture. That is not a mountain, y'all. It's a mountain, but it's a mountain of coal ash. That is a landfill. It's a landfill that takes in trash from 33 states and also special waste. So they have 4 million tons of coal ash. That landfill was built on top of an old plantation cemetery. So a lot of times in environmental justice, we don't care about the living and we don't care about the dead either. That's why you see a lot of Black churches and Black cemeteries being targeted for these highways and uses. The other picture to the right, top right, so they got a catfish plant and catfish female. They have a cheese plant and cheese effluent that's sprayed on the ground. So you say, is that the cheese being sprayed? Like, no. So remember I said earlier about hog waste? When we flush our toilet, it goes to a sewage treatment plant, but hog waste, it doesn't. It goes to a pit and it gets sprayed on the fields. So when people in Uniontown flush their toilet, that waste goes to the containment pond. And then their waste gets sprayed on the ground. That is human waste being sprayed on the ground. So this is America, y'all, in 2020. You know, you got EJ, you got people dealing with EJ issues across the country, whether it be indigenous brothers and sisters who can't wash their hands to stop COVID-19 spreads because they don't have water. You got folks dealing with refineries in Richmond. You got folks in Cancer Alley who just got hit by Hurricane Laura, Mossville, Louisiana, where people have been relocated because of all the industry. We got EJ issues upon EJ issues across this country. Look at folks in Appalachia and how they've been impacted by coal mining and now the economic downturn because we got missions of just transition for them. How can citizen science be brought to bear to these huge problems in this country? What's happened to agricultural workers in this country? What's happening, you know, indoor air quality issues and asthma because of COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of people have to stay at home. What about people who have to stay at home and poor housing stock? Mold, mildew, dander, allergens. How can citizen science play a role there? Okay. I mean, these really big questions. And as an environmental scientist, I'm saying my field has not done enough. As an academia hasn't done enough. So we got to make sure citizen science picks up the slack, y'all. There's more that needs to be done. I have more slides. We've done, in this community, we helped them build a hyper-local air quality monitoring network to measure particulate matter. There's some of those pollution sources. It's not enough though. The technology is catching up with the need in some ways. As I said earlier about the EPA regulatory monitoring network is not capturing the exposure profile of these communities. They've been exposed to so many chemicals, but beyond the criteria air pollutants. So how can citizen science help fill that void, help fill that gap, help empower these communities? So I'm gonna end there. I got way too many slides. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. But let me go to my last slide. Sorry, I'm so bad with slides. Sorry, slide. Thank you, slide. So I'm gonna end it there, and I'll take questions if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. People can use their emojis, their reactions on the bottom, and people can put questions in the chat. And let's, hold on, let me check the time.
I see one question in the chat. I know we have 5 minutes before our next session. Do you think maybe we have time for 2 questions?
I'll be quick. I'll do lightning. Yeah, I'll take one.
Great. So this first question is, so many poor Indigenous and people of color kids fall through the cracks early, elementary and especially middle school. By the time people get to college, HBCU or not, it is too late for many kids. How can we support the relevant communities for EJ and public science to reach these youth earlier and intercept the school to prison pipeline?
Oh, that's a powerful question. So I think K to 12, exposure and relevance, y'all. We got to get K to 12. So in Maryland, we actually have, I think we're the first state in the country to have an environmental literacy mandate, right? So so you have environmental clubs. I think that's one way through the environmental clubs and through the STEM programs is to bring citizen science in. We've done some work with high schools in the area to do some monitoring at the high schools. That's a big part of our work is youth engagement. So I think if we're gonna get the most bang for the buck that we have when it comes to resources, K to 12 investments are the place to start. And again, doing citizen science for STEM is really something we should all be focused on. That's why I highlighted HBCUs, but you're exactly right. We need to be doing that at K to 12. That's the place to start. Because, and just real quickly, the reason why I said it is, Even you bring the issue of lead, right? You know, I like to say is how are we going to put America first when we put our kids first? So this is exactly the point you're making. We got to bring citizen science into the classroom. And so their classroom is no longer the indoors. Their classroom is their community. Make it proximal, make it relevant, make it local. Next question, or last question.
Yeah, this is the last one. Then we really have to get to our next session. And you only have a minute for this one. So how do you integrate, teach, model the 5 types of science to your students?
So what we do is I teach environmental justice courses. We bring that into the courses. How we model it in the work, we make sure that we are matching up students with community groups. So every project that we basically work on, we have like a client, a community client. And then also part of what we do as a lab, we have MOUs with our community partners. So we build that into the MOUs with our community partners. So there's some other things I could say, but if you want to learn more about what we're doing, you can go to siegelab.org and see all the projects and also register for the symposium. So that's CEEJHlab.org. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the time. Sorry, I couldn't get to the other 45 slides.